Today I want to talk about contradictory imagery in the New Testament in relation to two things. First of all, Paul's belief that there is a veil over the minds of the Jewish people, so that whenever they read the scriptures, they cannot recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, as I said in my other videos, a veil, you can actually see through a veil. This is something St. Paul doesn't know, because he was a man and he never wore a veil. But the fact is, a veil is very thin material, and for instance, Muslim ladies, when they wear the burqas, they're wearing the veil, but they can still see. They can handle money, they can tell the difference between a potato and an onion in a supermarket. They don't need to remove the veil to read a receipt when they buy anything in the shops. They can read clearly and they can see clearly, even though they're wearing a veil. And this is the case when a woman wears a veil. She can actually see. The purposes of a veil is so that the onlooker, the person looking at the person wearing the veil, cannot see the face clearly. That is the purpose of a veil, and that's why some Muslim ladies wear the veil, because they don't want their face to be fully seen, at all. And that's why some ladies on the wedding day wear a veil, so it's a sort of partial disguise. But what you have to remember about the veil is that the person actually wearing the veil can actually see clearly, and this is something that St. Paul would not know, because he's a man and he never wore a veil. Now, the second point is about the curtain in the temple, in the holiest of holies, which the high priest entered once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, to offer atonement for the sins of the Jewish people. He would only go into this area once a year, and there, in this place, the holiest of holies, was a curtain, a veil, for want of a better word. And so we're told in the Gospels that at the exact time that Jesus died and said the words, "It is finished," at the exact time the curtain split in two in the holiest of holies. Now, as I pointed out, it would be impossible for anybody to know the exact moment when Jesus died, because he was in such a weakened state and would be mumbling and incoherent. Nobody would be able to tell what he was saying. Nobody would be able to hear what he was saying. The cause of death when a person is crucified is always heart failure, so he would be breathless and mumbling. Nobody would be able to hear him. They might think he was dead, and in fact he wasn't dead, he would just be resting his head. And the only time they would be absolutely sure he was dead, when they took him down from the cross, and then he would be medically examined by a doctor, because crucifixion was a weekly event, and they had to be quite sure the person was dead, and a doctor would be present to check that there was no pulse and the heart had stopped beating, right? There would be no way for anyone to be absolutely certain of the exact moment when Jesus exactly died, And there was no way of correlating that exact moment when Jesus died to the curtain in the holiest of holies splitting in two. You have to remember, in the holiest of holies, that area was empty all the time. The only time there was anybody in that holiest of holies was once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Now, when Jesus died, it was Passover. It was not the Day of Atonement. It was not the Day of Atonement. So when Jesus died, it would be 99% with certainty that there would be nobody in the holies of holies. The priest would not be there. I am not saying it's not absolutely impossible, because it could be, for some fluky reason, that the high priest might need to go into that holies of holies. But the chances of him doing that would be so very remote. The third thing you need to bear in mind concerning the curtain is that St. Paul would never have seen the curtain. He would never have seen the curtain. The Jewish people would never have seen that curtain in the holies of holies. This was a privileged, private, inner sanctuary, the sanctum of the holies of holies in the temple. The only people that would see that curtain would be the high priest and maybe the second or third in command. So St. Paul would have no idea what that curtain would look like at all. So what we have alleged happening here is that Jesus, at the exact moment he died, when it was claimed in the Gospels, he said the words, "It is finished." It is alleged and believed that the curtain in the holies of holies split in two. But as I just said, how would you know the curtain of the holies of holies had split in two? How would you know if it happened, if it did happen, when it happened? How would you know when it happened? Considering the fact there is nobody in that holies of holies. It is empty all the year round except for the Day of Atonement. And Jesus was not crucified on the Day of Atonement. Again, I'm thinking of two contradictory images. Images that these seem to contradict one another. Think of it. St. Paul is saying that there was a veil, a curtain for want of a better word, over the minds of the Jewish people. He had this image of the veil. He was probably thinking of that curtain in the holies of holies, right? He was probably thinking of the curtain, because he's thinking if a veil is over your eyes, you can't see. That's what he thinks. But of course St. Paul has never worn a veil. He doesn't know that when you wear a veil, you can see. So we have the veil, which is supposed to be symbolic, as far as St. Paul is concerned, of not being able to see. And then we have the curtain splitting in two in the holies of holies, which is supposed to symbolize the opening of a new way of entering into a new relationship with God, a new covenant. This is a new agreement. And so it's perceived and believed that the curtain is split in two, and therefore it suggests a new covenant, a new access to God, that it suggests almost that you didn't have access to God, but now you do. But of course this is not true, because there's always been access for everybody to God, as the Hebrew Bible makes clear. Everybody has access to God through prayer. But the New Testament belief is somehow the splitting of the curtain in the holiest of holies is supposed to symbol validity in believing in Jesus, that he is the way, the truth, the life, and no one can come to the Father but by him. So it's a split curtain and inferring Jesus. So a split curtain would imply from the New Testament position that here is the ability to be able to see God. But again, that's juxtaposed, if that's the right word, you know the word I'm trying to say, with St. Paul's also saying that we have the veil over the Jewish people's eyes so they cannot see. So we've actually got two different things going on here. We have Paul alleging that the Jewish people are wearing a veil. God has placed a veil of them over their eyes so they cannot see Jesus in the Hebrew Scriptures. And yet what we're also being told in the New Testament is that the curtain is split in two in the holies of holies, thereby suggesting that Jesus is the way to God, that he has opened a new way up to God, that somehow he is providing something that was not provided under the what is referred to the Mosaic covenant, what the New Christians regard as the Old Covenant. So in a sense it's suggesting a new way which the Christian believes the blind can see. The blind can see. You're believing in Jesus, the blind can see. But we've also got this other image of St. Paul saying the Jewish people are blind and God has put a veil over the Jewish people. So what's going on here? Are the scriptures saying that at the same time as Jesus is died, that a new way is opened by the split curtain in the holiest of holies, that people are now not blind, they can have access to God through Jesus. He is the light. You can see the light. You have access to the light. You have access to God. You have eternal life. It's all very positive. The curtain splitting, seeing the light, walking through that curtain, having a chat with God, so to speak, coming into a close relationship to God through Jesus, all of that. But at the same time, we're also led to believe that God has, at the same time as doing all of that, provided this new way, has also at the same time blinded the Jewish people so that they cannot recognize Jesus as a Messiah. So we're being told that God has blinded his own people, the Jewish people, so they cannot recognize what is supposed to be their Messiah. So in a sense what I'm seeing is two contradictory images presented here in the New Testament that seem to be contradicting the way of God, for want of a better expression. Because in the St. Paul's analogy, as far as his understanding and belief is, and what Christians believe, is God has blinded the Jewish people so they couldn't recognise that Jesus is the way, the truth, the life, that he is the Messiah, he is the promised one of God, he is the Messiah, and so on. And yet at the same time, we're being told that the curtain is split in two at the exact moment Jesus died. But as I've said, nobody would know that anyway. Then nobody would know that because nobody was actually in the temple, in the holiest of holies, when Jesus actually died. And so I hope I'm making it clear that these two images and the interpretations of these two things seem to be contradicting one another. It's not consistent. It's not consistent. Surely if God was going to provide split the curtain in the holiest of holies, representing a new way, a way of light, a way of sight, a way of new communion with God, why would he then continue or at the same time blind his Jewish people, his own people, to the recognition of this light, which is supposed to be Jesus? And I think this is very, very confusing and contradictory. And it's something I've never actually thought about when I was a Jewish believer in Jesus, which I was for 42 years. What changed that position was my re-examination of the Hebrew scriptures, looking at it and listening to it and considering it from the Jewish point of view, which I'd never really done as an 18-year-old. And so it's these three things that I've talked about in depth in my other videos, and which this is like a postscript to those videos of just saying how confusing the imagery is and the interpretation of this imagery in the New Testament. How literally uncredible it is. It's uncredible. It's not incredible. It's not credible. It's not credible. Nobody would know if the curtain had split, when it split. There is no account in the New Testament of who found this split curtain in the holiest of holies. I would expect a date and a time when this was discovered. No mention of this. I don't have a time of death for the death of Jesus. I don't have a record in the Gospels of an examining doctor stating the date and time of death, which I would have expected of the Romans, very particular. They would want surely a doctor there to confirm that Jesus was actually dead before they would bury him. The last thing they would want was Jesus sort of rising literally from deep sleep and rest and then doing walkabouts. They have to be sure that Jesus is deaded. And if Jesus was found to be dead at the very end, how long would it take for somebody to rush over to the temple to try and locate that high priest, who was very, very busy and would not be just available to any person that would seek to pop in, any member of the public, to have a chat about something or other, over something that concern very important, concern a man that's just been crucified, i.e. has anything odd or strange happened in the temple because Jesus has just died. I think even if somebody was attempting to do that, to try and locate the high priest, I think that could take an hour or two, considering the difficulty we all have in trying to reach higher beings in administrative buildings. I think it would be exactly the same in the temple, of trying to be believed, of anybody trying to give you the time of day, of anybody being willing to check in the holies of holies. Has anything happened in the holies of holies, anything unusual, because this man Jesus has just died? And so I find all of this not credible, not believable, and it seems to me to smack very much of superstition and rumour and conjecture, and very much people using their imagination. It smacks very much of gossip, to be honest. The accounts are so poor in the New Testament that they don't seem to be backed up with sources. I mean, well, I would expect somebody who is doing research 20 years after the death of Jesus to provide an account, to have more detail and support of where all this information is coming from. And again, I want to come back to the most important point, is that wearing a veil does not prevent anybody from seeing. Now, what do you say about somebody like me who believed, I thought, that Jesus was the Messiah from the Hebrew Scriptures as I understood them at that time at the age of 18, and then at the age of 59, having another look at those scriptures and getting more information, a lot more information that I didn't have at the age of 18 from the rabbis. In other words, I was given more information concerning those very scriptures, and in the light of that new information, I realised I was wrong. I realised that the scriptures didn't mean what I thought they meant. What has happened to somebody like me? You would say, the Christian, well, you were blind and then you recognised Jesus was the Messiah. So what has happened to me? I would say what has happened to me is I've reevaluated that which I thought meant one thing, and considered the possibility that it might mean something else, and I then have to weigh it up, which I did. I weighed things up and I realised that the case presented by the rabbis was in fact more credible than what I had been believing, which is quite embarrassing, especially when you've held to a belief for 42 years and you believe you're right, just as you believe you're right. So I would say my position has changed because I have been willing to look at information and consider a different way of reading it, because it's how we read things in the light of our understanding and what we're told about it. I thought I had understood the Hebrew Scriptures, but had only been listening to the non-Jewish interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures. It was only when I listened to the rabbis and heard what they had to say about the Hebrew Scriptures that I realised, in my view, I could see that the Christians are mistaken in how they have interpreted and how they have read and perceived the Hebrew Scriptures. And you have to remember that St. Paul originally believed from the Hebrew Scriptures that Jesus was not the Messiah, and that he was speaking blasphemy. What changed St. Paul's position was a spiritual experience. You've had spiritual experiences, and I've had spiritual experiences. But I reached a point when I'd re-examined the Hebrew Scriptures and I'd listened very, very carefully for a long time. I had to say, who am I believing? My spiritual experiences were very strong, compelling, and convincing, and held me strongly for 42 years. Or was it the Scriptures as I was now reading them? And I made that decision. How could I hang on to believing in spiritual experiences that I was having when the Hebrew Scriptures, as I understood them, completely contradicted what I believed from my spiritual experiences to be true? In other words, who is right? Is it our spiritual experience, or is it the Hebrew Scriptures? And it was a real dilemma because 98% of me could see and understand intellectually, blatantly understanding with my mind, with considered thought, evaluation, careful thought and evaluation. I could see that 98% of me was totally and completely in agreement with the rabbis. That 2% that was holding me back was my spiritual experience. And I took that decision to relinquish the spiritual experience, to say, I am not hanging on to this 2% spiritual experience, which convinced me that Jesus was the Messiah, that God had revealed to me that Jesus was the Messiah, and I decided to go with my 98% conviction from the Hebrew Scriptures that Jesus is not the Messiah. And so this is my position today. I understand your position because I was like you, and I was a very strong believer, Jewish believer in Jesus for 42 years. And I won't tell you that I don't have my little niggles of inverted commas panicked out. But this isn't surprising because was a believer for 42 years. I mean, that's a lifetime. But intellectually looking at the scriptures, I know with my reasoned mind, it is so clear and obvious to me that Jesus is not the Messiah. And these panicky little moments of doubts I would liken it to the fact, when you're getting married and perhaps the day before you're sort of getting a little bit panicky and thinking, oh, what if I don't like him after a week? What if he gets on my nerves and I can't stand him after a week? It's like that panic. And so I'm being honest with you because I recognise there's going to be other people like me who have given up Jesus after a very long period of time and having little panicky doubts. And what I would say is I think this is normal. I think it would be very odd if I didn't have these panicky little niggles. I do get these little niggles, but I think this is not doubt with a reason. This is doubt, I think, based on the fact that I've held this belief in Jesus for 42 years. And to suddenly realise that all of what I was holding on to, the foundation of everything was not true. And it's the most devastating experience of my life, apart from bereavement, obviously losing my mother. That was devastating, the first bereavement, but it's absolutely devastating. But I can't go backwards because I can't go back to believing in Jesus, because my understanding from the Hebrew Scriptures is now I can see it's blasphemy. It's blasphemy because we are called as Jews to worship one God, and I just refuse to worship him. I refuse to worship him. And as you know, that's what believing in Jesus involves. If you're a Jewish believer in Jesus, that's what it is involved. To believe in Jesus as a Jew means you worshipping Jesus, and I refuse to do that. So I hope you find this postscript to my other videos helpful. I'm trying my best to make myself clear. It's very difficult because I am very, very, very unwell with very severe ME, and I'm suffering a lot with angina and things like that. So it's very, very hard, but I feel it is important that I state my point of view. I believe that I'm right, obviously, in my belief that Jesus is not the Messiah, but I will freely admit I could be wrong. I would not be so arrogant as to presume, how can I say it? I would just not presume to be so arrogant as to know I understand everything about God. I find the whole experience of going from one belief to another so traumatic and so strange and so peculiar, and I can't work the whole thing out. But I have to stay with the position I'm in at the moment because there is nothing to convince me to move back to my previous position, if you can understand me. And I think these questions that or these observations that I'm making, I think they're valid and I think legitimate. And I think all people who have a faith in Jesus should be listening and considering these things that I am saying, whether I'm right, inverted commas, or whether I'm not. I still think that what I have something to offer and to bring to the table for you to think about and consider. I know it makes you feel uncomfortable, and I know Christianity is about don't listen to people like me, because you mustn't think, Christians would say, people like me are causing you to doubt your faith. I'm not asking you to doubt your faith. I'm actually asking you to examine your faith. Re-examine your faith. There's no harm in examining your faith and re-examining your faith. Because if your faith is true and legitimate and valid, it will stand scrutinization. I decided after 42 years to re-evaluate my belief in Jesus, and I surprisingly came to the conclusion that Jesus was not the Messiah. I have to tell you, I did not expect this. I did not do the re-evaluation of my faith to discover this. I thought I'd just be learning more things and it would be all very interesting. I never thought for one moment that it would lead me to the conclusion that Jesus was not the Messiah. I am being perfectly honest with you. There's no way I thought that would happen, because I was strongly rooted in my faith for 42 years. I don't think there is any harm if you re-evaluate things carefully, weighing things up. And at the end of the day, we all have to make the decision according to the information that is presented to us and according to the way we understand it at the moment of time in our lives. There are things that we don't understand when we're children, that we understand when we're older. And then there are things we understand when we're older, but then there's more things we need to understand. And so I just hope that these thoughts of mine and observations are helpful, and that you find them constructive, and it helps you to work out what you believe and why you believe it, and to explore further anything that you're not happy about, that doesn't quite make sense. Because when I started exploring things in depth about the age of 30, I saw things that didn't make sense, but because of my spiritual experiences, I didn't feel there was any need to explore these questions further. In other words, I was hanging on to my spiritual experiences as proof and as a hallmark for my faith, and I think I was mistaken. I think I should have paid attention to the warning bells of my things that were of concern to me that didn't make sense in the Hebrew Scriptures, and followed it through and investigated it. And that's what I'm asking for you to do, is not be frightened of exploring your faith. Of course, when you have a faith, I think there's a difference between people being deliberately provocative to try and be mean and horrible and spiteful to get you to doubt God. And then there's constructive criticism or constructive questions. And it is not a sin to ask constructive questions. This is not about doubting God. This is about clarifying questions with God. There's nothing wrong in asking God a question. There's nothing wrong in praying God about things. Any question. There's nothing wrong in saying to God, why? I don't understand. I would like to get greater clarification. Right? This doesn't make sense. And so I would say don't feel guilty about it. Don't feel guilty about it. And of course the church in the New Testament doesn't want you to do this because it's all about, they don't want you to question. But I would say that if you believe that Judaism, that the Hebrew scriptures are the root of what you believe, if you believe it's all come from the Hebrew scriptures, then I think it's those Hebrew scriptures that you need to re-examine. And I would say listen to the rabbis. Listen to the rabbis. We are the people of the book. And I don't accept that God has blinded his own people to the pearls and the treasures in the Hebrew scriptures. Why would he do that? Why would he blind his own people to salvation and truth? Looking at it from your perspective, why would God blind his own people so that they cannot recognize truth and salvation and then end up being sent to hell for not believing in Jesus?